Okay, we just left off with the Persian Wars, in which we've seen the Persian withdraw. Ultimately, what we're going to see happen as a result is a golden age of Athens, the golden age of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman, and later on the Peloponnesian conflict. This victory over the Persians is going to be fleeting. So when we look at this presentation, I'm not going to go terribly in depth with it. We're going to have a lot of source activities on these two topics in class, but you need to understand it, so please go over the reading well too as well. Why was it such a golden age, and, or maybe but, ultimately how did it lead to the Peloponnesian conflict, which is ultimately, as we'll see, going to lead to the downfall of Athens as a major player in the region, at least politically. Culturally, they're still relevant. So, with the growth of the Athenian Empire, we have the formation of the Delian League. We saw this in the last presentation. After the Persian War, the Greek sense of uniqueness and culture was increased. The Greeks formed a military alliance called the Delian League. Now, Sparta was part of it. It was put in place to expel, to harass, and ultimately get to have the Persians leave the area. Athens emerges as its head. This is extremely significant, as Athens is going to grow exponentially in power and really going to become a dominant figure right after the Persian Wars. The treasury is moved to Athens, and even those, and we're going to see this have a downfall of the Delian League later on against the Spartan Confederacy, they're going to force people to stay whether they like it or not. There's going to be resentment amongst some of the other Greek city-states. Some of them are going to leave and join the rival Spartan Confederacy or Peloponnesian Confederacy as well. Now let's talk about this golden age of Pericles. He's going to bring a golden age of Athens. Civic participation is one of the goals of Pericles. Now, when you see him trying to increase the amount of democracy and access to democracy, remember that he is doing this for his own political gain. He is trying to control Athens from within its democratic boundaries instead of taking over as some sort of tyrant or oligarchy or king or something. We're going to have paid salaries to men who held in public office, but once again, he's the one authorizing it. It's going to help him in power as well. Quote here by Pericles, "We alone regard a man who takes no interest in public affairs not as harmless but as a useless character." That idea of civic participation is a common theme amongst most of Pericles' speeches. He's also going to foster a lot of construction projects. Remember, Xerxes has his forces burn Athens to the ground during the Second Persian Wars after the Battle of Thermopylae. Pericles is going to be there to rebuild. Athens is going to become a very large, cosmopolitan city in which you have various groups of people that are coming into this area as a trade outpost. One of the most important construction projects of Pericles is the Parthenon, built on top of the Acropolis. You can still see the ruins today. Now, there was a large statue of Athena built within the Parthenon, commissioned by the sculptor Phidias, which we'll be talking more about in Chapter 3 with cultural contributions. But once again, very important, that idea of patron gods. If you look at the top, now there's 46 Doric columns. If you look at the top here, it looks almost like Egyptian hieroglyphics in some ways. It depicts victories, particularly of the Athenians, in the First and Second Persian Wars. It really commemorates these moments that the Athenians had. There was this real sense of identity developed amongst the Athenians that they're not only Greeks, but they are the rightful rulers of all of Greece. If you look at in your textbook, it's an insert. There is a great primary source called the Million Dialogues, in which it explains how Athens should be dominating the Delian League. Athens should be in charge of everybody because they're better than everybody else, okay? And how dare you even question that idea? If you haven't read it, please read it. It'll help you understand the mindset of Athenians during this time period. Along with rebuilding the city and the Parthenon, you have the Assembly, the lawmaking body of Athens. It meets several times. You have 6,000 members. When you have a large body like that, however, it can be one of two ways. It can be chaos, or it can be centered around a few or one key political figures. In this case, it's Pericles. He's able to really dominate this very large body, basically saying, hey, listen, I know we've got a lot of different ideas and opinions. I understand them all. Just trust me, this is what's right for Athens. He's really able to merge and consolidate a lot of his power from within these democratic houses. Now, members of the polis were so admiring of the Greeks, particularly the Athenians. But remember, these are only free adult males. This is still a society that is built on the subjection of women. This is still a society that is closed off as far as its democratic ideals to foreigners. And it is still a society that relies heavily on slave labor. Now, overall, we are going to see, it's still limited, but we are going to see civic participation increase under Pericles' reforms. You also have the idea come up of ostracism being widely used. To defend against overly ambitious political members, you can ostracize them. You can kick them out of the city for 10 years. In many ways, Pericles installs this and uses it, utilizes it to get rid of any potential rivals to power. Anybody who felt that he was dominating from within, he can expose of through a democratic process with these 6,000 members. It's difficult to do, but we can see it in the historical records that it does happen. You'd think, oh, well, something like this would never actually happen, but it does. People were ostracized from the community. Socrates, the great Greek philosopher, is put on trial for corrupting the youth of Athens, which was a bogus charge, which we'll talk about next chapter. But he is given the opportunity to choose ostracism. He doesn't. He's an old man. He decides to drink the hemlock poison, and he ultimately dies. But it's there. Cultural center of Greece is really what Athens becomes during this age of Pericles. The backdrop, let me go back here. In the backdrop of the Persian Wars, in the backdrop of this Athenian domination of the Delian League, and what I'm going to talk about next, the Peloponnesian conflict, you have the rise of classical Greek culture. You have the rise of Greek tragedy, Greek drama. You have the movements of philosophy. Engineering takes hold. Great writing. The first historian in history is Herodotus. He wrote the Persian Wars. The first objective historian of history that we know of, Thucydides, who's not writing about the interaction of gods and the battles and the affairs of people, writes about the Peloponnesian conflict, which we need to discuss right now. Hey, look at that. Nice transition. Now, let's talk about this Athenian domination of the Delian League. A league denotes there's some sort of shared common bonds, but really it's a league in name only. The Athenians are trying to forge their own empire throughout the Aegean and the Mediterranean. They're doing this through three ways. We got to talk about these three ways. Suppression of localities. They would move in, they would take over all the necessary and most profitable businesses, economics, or financial or government institutions that they could. They would put their own people there. They would station parts of the Athenian navy there. There are even some cases of cities starving and the Athenian navy not allowing food to be imported to the area until they accepted their rule. Now, these were not defenseless city-states. They had their own armies. Many of them did not agree with the demands that Athens was placing by being in charge of this Delian League. However, Athens had a program of when they would first land and dock and meet with the leaders in government, that they would ask those leaders to go to Athens. All they're doing is really exporting any sort of leaders that could rise up against Athens and getting them out of there. You take them to Athens, and they're basically political prisoners. But they're not prisoners with chains or with bars or anything like that. They're not tortured or beaten. You kill them with kindness. You give them a nice place to live. You give them free access to the city. You allow civic participation in government. And all of a sudden, they're not really that concerned with what's going on at home, especially if they're able to bring their family and friends with them, which most of the time they were. Now, with the major leadership that could cause any problems for Athens gone, with them taking over all of the commerce and the businesses and suppressing the localities and basically making themselves a large workforce for whatever Athens needed for the time being to help forge this empire. You heavily tax the people. This flies in the face of everything that we saw with, say, Cyrus and Cambyses and Darius in the Persian Empire. You heavily tax them, you suppress them, and they are not treated well. This is ultimately going to backfire, because when Athens calls them for military support, oftentimes they're not going to get what they wanted. To counter this, Sparta sees the writing on the wall. As soon as Athens starts to dominate this league, they leave. They know what Athens is going to try to do, so they form their own league. It's otherwise known as the Peloponnesian League or the Spartan Confederacy, as sometimes you'll see in the literature, or I may refer to it like that in class. Ultimately, we get 27 years of war. Now, it starts out slow. You have some of these attacks going back and forth. Sparta's alliance started to react to Athens. You have 300 Thebans. Sparta's ally, they attack Athens' ally up plateau. Athens starts placing up blockades, and we really enter into this first phase of the war. Sparta marches. They attack Attica. They attack Athens. Massive casualties on both sides. However, Sparta, almost all the time, is going to come out somewhat on top. They have too powerful of a land army. Athenians are naval-based. And remember, because they're trying to control this entire Delian League spread out through the Aegean Sea, they don't have the full force of their navy in any one spot at any time during this attack, or during this war. Excuse me. So, Athens tries to mount an offensive. They send their navy off the coast of the Peloponnesus, Sparta's homeland, and they have several victories. Okay? However, because of this powerful land army, the Spartans are going to march directly onto Athens. Now, Athens has walls built around it after the Persian Wars. Pericles, who's in charge, says, okay, we're going to have fighting in the countryside. I need everybody from the countryside to move into the city, and it's disastrous for Athens. It's too much. They can't handle that population. They're losing the battle outside, and they're losing the battle inside. Now, Pericles, and you're going to read parts of it in class, delivers his famous funeral oration, trying to inspire people to fight on. How ultimately it's not going to work. 1 out of 3 people are actually going to be killed by a plague that wipes out Athens. I mean, it's terrible. We believe it's typhus, with basically it's deterioration of skin. It's a flesh-eating virus almost. Pericles himself is going to die from the disease. The other generals are never really able to take over. Now, we get a period where after Athens is decimated, both sides sort of go home and try to replenish their forces. Sparta is actually going to call on an old foe of Persia and ask them for naval support to the northeast. Now, Persia never really attacks Athens, but still, the fact that Persia's naval force is mobilized in the northeast, Athens really has no recourse to go ahead and attack the Peloponnesus, because as soon as they leave themselves defenseless, they have the threat of the Persians landing at Athens and taking over. Ultimately, the Spartans are going to take over, the Athenian navy is decimated, and the Spartans install the short-lived 30 tyrants. It only lasts for about a year until they're able to expel. Ultimately, the effects of this Peloponnesian War, Athens is never going to be the great superpower that it wants to be or was for a very short time in history. Culturally, yes, still extremely relevant and significant. You're going to see the rise of Alexander of Macedon. Aristotle, great Greek philosopher of Athens, is going to be his tutor. So culturally, they're still relevant, but as far as a political or military entity, they're not. Democracy is going to suffer as well. But the ideas are going to survive, don't get me wrong. We're going to see fighting continue to disrupt the Greek world. Sparta itself is going to end up being defeated by Thebes, another Greek city-state which they were previously aligned with. Ultimately, Greece is left vulnerable to invasion. They're low on supplies, and that's what's going to happen. as we'll see in Chapter 3. Thanks for listening.